Welcome to Bridging Gaps, the business podcast sharing the challenges and stories of fellow business owners.
Hello and welcome. I'm Debra Levitt, your host. In this conversation, I'm speaking with Elaine Gosden of Blue GNU Consulting. This conversation with Elaine is a really special conversation because in it, she shares the story of how she lost her partner 15 years ago. Marc was in the Navy, and today being Remembrance Day, it's entirely right that we remember him along with all of the other people who have given their lives for their country. Elaine shares her story of losing a loved one in conflict, of how it impacted her, of the changes that she made to her life as a result of this, and how he's still part of her life. She's married, she has 2 children, but he's still there, part of her life, and she wants to make sure that he's never forgotten and that his legacy is one of positivity. You might notice that our conversation comes to a rather abrupt end. Unfortunately, I've encountered some problems with the audio file, and the latter part of the interview has had to be removed. I will aim to get Elaine back on so that we can finish off all of those last bits and talk to her a bit more. But in the meantime, please enjoy our conversation and join me now in welcoming Elaine Gosden. Hi, Elaine. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. Do you want to just explain to our listeners a little bit about what Blue GNU Consulting is, what it is that you do?
Sure. So Blue GNU is a consulting business that my husband and I run together, but we both consult on very different things. So he is very technical and quite medical in his consulting. So he works in the pharmaceutical industry, which is coincidentally where we met. And his side of the business is about getting medical products licensed for use on patients in the UK. My side of the business is nothing to do with that. My side is very focused on personal development, getting the best out of people, specifically leaders and teams. So any and every shape of leadership development and personal development, really.
And so when you're doing that, are you going into bigger companies and providing that as a service to them? Or are people coming to you and going, oh, I just got promoted to be a manager, I think I need some help? You know, what direction does it come?
It more often than not comes from the companies, the corporations who have identified a need, but they don't really know how to address it. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not always large companies, although lots of my clients have got, more than 4,000 employees. Some of them, a client I work really closely with, has only got about 23 employees in their office, but they come to me for all of their development. So if someone wants an IT course, they'll ring me and say, could you help us find one? We're not really sure about all this training stuff. And likewise, if they want to have a corporate away day and really push the boat out for a big celebration of a new listing or a new sale, then they'll call me in to host and run that with a development twist for them. So it depends on the client and what the client wants.
So you're really there depending on the client. You can either be providing that single point of contact for all of their learning and development, or you can just be doing the leadership talks and development for the executives.
That's right.
And what do you find? Do you find that there are any constants across people that, most people have the same barriers in terms of being a better leader and development, or is it different to every individual?
I think the biggest challenge with developing leaders is, and it's kind of a 3-point problem in that the people we put to be as our leaders, or the people that get promoted to be leaders, are usually excellent at their jobs. So then we promote them to be leaders because they're excellent at their jobs. But one of the challenges of leadership is you're not often doing your job. You're leading other people to do the work that perhaps you used to do. So it's a real gear change. It's like from moving from 3rd to 4th gear in the car, which sometimes is really smooth for some people. But sometimes it can be a really clunky gear change and it can go all wrong. So it's about, I think, leadership for me, the key theme is how tricky it is from a people side of things. And people often talk about the soft skills in leadership. And I rebuke that. I think there's nothing soft about leadership. I think it's hard. I think it's tough. And I think to have some leadership conversations that all leaders need to have, it's actually really difficult. And if you haven't had any support with learning how to do some of that stuff, that's when you can come across some real hot water, or create a culture even in a team or an organisation that you didn't intend to create. Perhaps just a flippant comment has made people feel a certain way, which has then become a bit pandemic, and then things begin to spread. So I think it's number one, turning on the leadership self-awareness button and reminding leaders that they're there to lead, and that's a different set of skills than the skills they may be trained in, whatever their career was.
As you say, if you've come through and you've been the doer and you've been fantastic at doing, it doesn't mean you're going to make a great leader. And it might be that you've got potential for it, but you may not get there on your own.
Yeah.
Or you might get there through a lot of people falling by the wayside as you figure out how to be a better leader.
Exactly. And so the problem the organisation faces, this 3-point problem I was talking about earlier, is they've lost an amazing worker because they've promoted them into a leader. They've gained a problem with the leader in terms of needing to invest and develop in that leader if they want to be successful. And then the third point is they have to recruit to fill the gap that they've left. So it's a real challenge, promoting people into leadership positions, and not a lot of organisations think strategically enough about doing that proactively. They tend to do it and then realise the error it's made, which it still surprises me after 20 years working in the industry. People are still going around that roundabout.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because you'd think that by now there would be that awareness, because it's like projects. When I speak to people about projects and what, as a project manager background, the biggest failure that everybody acknowledges in projects is communication. The biggest failure that new project will have will be communication. And it doesn't matter how much we talk about it, it will still be a failure. And it's kind of like that maybe with the leadership, where we all know that it's a problem, but don't necessarily know what to do or how to fix it.
Totally.
So are you going in and speaking to people? So do you go in and actually work with people to say, hang on a second, you brought me in to work with this particular leader or with this team. However, this is an indication of a problem you have generally within the organization. Do you want me to work with you to help to develop those skills at an earlier stage so that people coming through that pipeline reach the leadership with not quite so big as a step up to take?
It can work like that. To be fair, the majority of projects I work on are where you get a proactive CEO or a proactive HR director or a proactive anyone who's got buying power and a bit of people strategy going on. And they're the ones that say, I can foresee that this is an issue, or I've already started to detect the signs within the organisation that this isn't right. And the signs are really clear from an HR perspective. People begin to leave, people aren't engaged with the proposition of the organisation or whatever. You tend to, if you're connected to your people, you can spot these things happening. So sometimes they know that the dirge is happening, the bad stuff's happening. They just don't know how to correct it. And people development's a really sensible place to start, because if people feel invested in, whether they're a leader or not, it makes a huge difference to how much extra effort they'll put in and how engaged they'll be with the organisation. So typically it's with particularly proactive people who know there's either going to be an issue or there is already an issue that's started to occur, and then they want to put steps in place to address that.
And are you normally working one-to-one with individuals, or is it a combination of teams and one-to-one?
That's another great question. It's usually with groups. So I usually get invited to come and work with a particular batch of leaders or a particular section of an organisation or a particular team if they're in turmoil. But then what happens is that will then lead to some one-to-one relationships, because obviously the downside of working in groups is you can't meet everyone's needs with one intervention. And training without coaching is just entertainment. So it's a lovely day out. But actually, if we're not going to do anything about that, or if we can't distill out, well, what are the individual's concerns and what individual actions are going to take place, then there's almost no point investing the cash in the first place. So it typically starts with groups, and then what I find is I then end up going back in to do a lot of follow-up coaching with the either particular individuals, or if the organisation is willing enough to invest, with all the individuals, which is where you see the best results.
Yes, because, it just makes sense, doesn't it? That bringing everybody up to the same level of leadership and the same kind of messages that they're giving would, give a huge benefit to the organization. Do you find, though, that people... So when you've got some people coming in, are there leaders who maybe don't recognize that they're the problem?
Yes.
That was an easy answer.
Yes, there are leaders who don't recognise that they're part of the problem, and that's where the one-to-one coaching can really help. So I've got a few diagnostic tools up my sleeve that help people to understand, if they don't understand, why their style might be a problem. So, perhaps it's something to do with some of their underlying beliefs about people. I do hear a lot at the moment about, well, they just don't get it. My team just aren't performing. The vision is clear. Why aren't they getting on with it? And it can be just down to individual style. And as you said earlier with projects, the communication. But if people aren't able to see why, well, what is it about the communication that's wrong? So if you can do a diagnostic tool like an underlying beliefs type questionnaire that gets to the root of, okay, so as a leader, when you behave like this, what is it about your underlying beliefs that leads you to that leadership action? Then we can begin to pick away at, well, where's the problem? And those kind of questionnaires are quite difficult to fudge, whereas there are some questionnaires that you can just tick them however you want and get whatever result you want.
I think this is probably the right answer.
Exactly. And in big corporations, that's a big problem, is that people think that, if I don't fill this thing out in a certain way, then I might lose my job or whatever, which has never happened in my experience. But nonetheless, the paranoia remains. So it's interesting to observe that as an outsider, because now I'm lucky enough not to be in a corporate organisation.
But as you say, it is that feeling of, well, am I really going to get an honest response? I remember one organisation I was contracting in, and they had sent out a questionnaire, which was about actually the organisation. And I wondered the same thing. Are they going to get a really honest, which is actually, I think this is bad or excellent, whichever way it is? Or are people just going to go, oh, yes, of course, because they know their initiatives to support this. And not everybody is confident enough to actually go, no, I'm going to stand by, because you never know what's going to happen. Every organization is continually evolving. There seem to be, with the bigger corporations, regular redundancies and that sort of thing. So having something which you can't really fudge is a good thing. And is this part of the insights? No, so the insights is a great way of beginning a self-awareness journey. So understanding, insights uses colour theories and uses Jungian typology, so the preferences of Carl Jung, to give you some colours that you might enjoy working with, and that's really helpful from if I understand that I lead with red and you lead with green and those two are different, well, what does that mean for our relationship? And insights is a great place to start, but from a leader's perspective, it gives you an entry point, but then there's more you need to do around, well, so why is that? And how do those colours and those preferences of me and my team serve me well? And when do they not serve me well? And there's learning in both. But things like underlying belief questionnaires, but the preferences are kind of implicit, but it's more about, so given this situation, well, what would you do? And people find those type of questionnaires harder to fudge, because there is no right or wrong answer. I mean, there sort of is, but there is no right or wrong answer. So they have to give their opinion. And that's when you can start poking around and, okay, so your opinion of how you lead is this. And we can see where the conflict then could occur if the opinions of the people you lead are different than you, or if their needs are different than your style. So it's my opinion of how I'm leading. Are you then also having the conversation with the team to get their opinion of how it's being led? Not particularly. So there's a theory about a good way to lead, and well, there's millions of leadership books out there. You can pick up, go to Waterstones and read thousands of leadership books. I subscribe to a few leadership theories, and one of the ones that I'm a particular fan of is creating the right environment for leadership. And there is a right way and a wrong way to do it for all people. I mean, we have to take into account their individual preferences, but there is a right way to do it. And that involves kind of creating the right culture within your team or within your organisation. And some people
where the organizational values and behavior overlap is that's how we treat each other. And it's so important to know that, and to have someone checking in your rearview mirror for you and letting you know how your actions, particularly in high profile leadership positions, influence what people say about you when you're not in the room. And that's another really interesting coaching question that I like to use with senior leaders is, what do you think the stories are that people are telling about you in this organisation? And it's curious that they always go to the negative first. They never really think of the positive.
So Elaine, if we can go back a little bit and just talk about how you actually got started and developed the skills and experience to be doing the coaching and development that you do with people now.
I left school when I was 16, and I didn't want to do further education. I'm a very active person. I like doing stuff rather than theorising about stuff. So I left school and went to do what used to be called YTS scheme, which nowadays would probably be called a modern apprenticeship or something like that, apprenticeship schemes. So I targeted a local company who were huge, biggest employer in the area. I knew they would have gaps and openings for lots of different types of jobs. And at the time I thought I wanted to be a secretary. So I enrolled onto a secretarial apprenticeship with them, which I was really lucky to get onto because it's a very tricky program to get onto, and started working there. While I was there, it was a big pharmaceutical company. I ended up staying there for a long time. But while I was there, I sort of decided I could kind of do the secretary stuff, and no disrespect to anyone who does secretarial work. It works for some people and not for others. But by the end of my first year, I felt as though I needed more development. And I spoke to the learning and development team who were in charge of the scheme internally and said, okay, can I have a rotation or a different placement, or could you put me in a new department, or what can we do? Because I feel like I need more development. And they said, oh no, there's nothing else. So you need to stay where you are for another year. And I was quite a opinionated young lady. So I told them what I thought about that. And I said, oh, hang on a minute. Aren't you called the learning and development team? Is it not your job to provide me with some development? And they didn't have anything, but I think they perhaps listened to my request and appreciated my pushback. So they actually created a position for me within the HR and training team. So I had a year working with them, which was wonderful. And I did 2.5 days with the HR team and 2.5 days with the learning and development team, doing all sorts of anything, admin work, dog's body work, you name it. I got involved with it and loved every second of it. But I very much was drawn to the learning and development team. I got on with the HR stuff and I appreciated its value within the organisation, but I was always drawn more to the training side of things. And I loved helping the trainers get ready for workshops and hearing about their wonderful stories of where they'd been and who they'd met and what they'd learned and whatnot. So at the end of my 2-year placement, I was really lucky that the training manager said to me, do you want a permanent job? And I said, yes, I do. And so I got one, and the rest is history, really. So I worked with that learning and development team for a long time. That was down in Kent where I grew up. But then they relocated about 3 years into my contract. They relocated their sales and marketing headquarters to Surrey. And so I was a real influential character in that move. So I was a real kind of champion of the move and trying to get people to come. Not everyone wanted to come, but the new office building was fantastic, still is. It's a state-of-the-art facility. And I was really enthusiastic about moving away from home, I think, and kind of creating something new. Yeah, totally. So I moved. I took a big risk and moved from Kent to Surrey, left my family behind and moved into a shared professional house with lots of other people who had also made the move, and none of us could really afford to buy our own houses in Surrey. So we rented together for a little while and came up here that way and sort of got settled into the area. So I stayed with them, that company, for about 8 years. But then I had a big life-changing event during that time and decided that I couldn't stay there. It was a bit too difficult in that job because it reminded me too much of the past. So I took 2 years out and I bought a house and I went travelling on my own for a long time and got one-way tickets and didn't really look back. But then if I stick to the career side of things, when I came back from travelling, which I had to do at some stage because my tenants weren't very nice. They kind of stopped paying rent and stuff. So I had to come
Not
home.
helpful.
No, had to come home and kick them out. And I returned to learning and development. I sort of had a real crossroads to decide, well, what am I going to do with myself now? You know, I met lots of people while I was traveling, learnt lots of new skills, went on lots of crazy adventures. But ultimately being back in the real world, you know, had some big career decisions to make, and decided I really, really liked learning and development and I still wanted to do it. So I got a job with a city law firm, who are one of those firms that bill every minute of every day to every client. But they were great, lovely, lovely small city law firm, in the learning and development team there. Really enjoyed it. But it was the pressure of that job was a lot. And at the time I just I'd known my future husband for a long time, but we decided we were going to get married, and we'd gotten engaged whilst I was working in the city. And it was about 3 months before our wedding, and we realised nothing was organised. So I actually gave up that job in the city to get organised and get married, and then got more learning and development type roles, part-time around kind of the marriage, because working full-time's not something I'm a massive fan of. And I guess I'm lucky enough to have that choice, but took on a few more local learning and development roles, one with the local police force here in Surrey, working in their L&D team, which was great. And then I moved from there to a head of learning and development role for a healthcare company in Reading. And then it was when I was working with them, and I just had my second baby, and I was literally fresh back from maternity leave. I was about 4 weeks back after maternity leave, and they announced a big restructure and the fact that L&D was being taken out of the business. So me and my very small team lost our jobs. But my HR director at that time said, if you set yourself up as self-employed, we will bring you back in as a freelance. There's some leadership programs they wanted me to continue to run, which I was happy to do. And they were my first client. And so I went freelance, and I haven't looked back.
Which is fantastic. And very brave as well, in terms of going off around the world and traveling. When I came over to England, I came over on a one-way ticket. And I can remember friends saying to me, how long are you going for? I don't know. Yeah. Whereas now it's actually harder to imagine doing that. But, so let's go back a little ways.
Yes.
You talked about the fact that there was, you know, an event in your personal life that made it really difficult for you to stay at that company. And I know that has led you to being, I guess, kind of some of the driving force behind you, like still very much a part of your thoughts and what keeps you going forward. So do you want to just share about that?
So it's a bit shocking. And so I'm very used to talking about it. So I'm very aware that I talk about it quite factually, and that people don't necessarily hear it as factually as I would like them to. And that's not because there aren't facts, but because it's quite a big piece of information to digest. So in 2003, my partner at the time, we were engaged to be married, but my partner was killed tragically during the Iraq war. So he went out, he was in the Royal Navy, and he went out to sea. He didn't know he was going to war necessarily, although the political climate at that time was pointing to a conflict again in the Gulf. But he left in January, and then he didn't come back, which is really sad. So he was killed in March 2003, whilst I was working at the pharmaceutical company, loving life, loving the job, loving the thought of marrying my sailor, my officer and a gentleman. But ultimately, he never came home. So that was a huge turning point in my life for me. And it did begin the process of thinking about running away and leaving and getting out of the life that I had, because I felt that was my only option at that time.
And do you feel that that's what you did when you went and did the traveling, that you did run away?
No, because I had the most amazing bereavement counsellor. So at the time, I was 23 years old. So I was very young, and I've mentioned before, I was quite opinionated. I still am to some degree, but I'm very headstrong. I know my own mind. And somebody suggested, in fact, it was my boss at the time, very soon after my partner's death, he suggested that I should get some counselling because it would all be paid for by the company. And bless them, they did amazing things in supporting my eventual return to work and looking after me from a sick leave perspective and compassionate leave, whatever you want to call it. But they did a great job with me. But my boss did sit me down quite early on and said, we think you should have some bereavement counselling just because of the scale of what's happened here. And I can't thank him enough, because I got a wonderful bereavement counsellor who, to begin with, I didn't like, because I thought she was another piece of authority sent to challenge me. And she was quite an elderly lady. And she, I remember in our first meeting, I gave her quite a hard time about, you're a really old lady and I'm not being funny, but how can you help me? I'm a really young girl and I've just lost my entire future. What on earth do you think you're going to do to help me with that? I'm pretty sure your partner's never been blown up. And bless her, she took it on the chin, and I did give her a hard time, harder than that. And she said, no, you're right. I have never been in your situation. She's like, but I have met many people who have experienced horrific grief and horrific bereavements of all kinds. And she said to me, give me a year. She said, just you may run from this, because she knew I had the desire to run. I think I shared that quite quickly. I just wanted to exit stage left as quickly as I could and run away from my old life. But she said, no, you stick with it. She's like, you give me a year. She's like, we'll meet every week, sometimes twice a week, which we did. And she was like, you will run from this, and that will be a good thing, because it will be a positive thing, because you will have dealt with it before you run. She's like, but if you run now, this will be a stigma you will always carry. And that I remember that conversation very clearly. And I trusted her. She was calm enough and logical enough. And I guess I was testing her a little bit. She was a real influential character for me, and I did book my flights, and I did go about a year and a month after the anniversary of Marc's death, because I think you have to go through all your firsts in that first year. You have to get a lot of firsts out of the way. A lot of people talk about that in bereavement and grief, and it's really important to acknowledge those firsts. But actually, the second year is the toughest, because people don't acknowledge the seconds. Yes. Everyone acknowledges the first, but not the seconds.
Well, because if they're not as close to the situation as well, it does become more distant in people's minds. Yeah. And it's natural, but it's very hard to necessarily to deal with that if it's you who they were the closest to. And did you find that so you said the company was really fantastic in how they supported you, and despite giving her a hard time, the bereavement counselor really, won you over and saw you through. Were your family going through a tough time as well, or were they feeling for you as well as for Marc, or were they, how were they helping you or not? Because sometimes people's grief means they're not helping you.
It's tricky. I mean, at the time, I have my brother and sister are a lot younger than me. So my sister's 12 years younger than me, and my brother's 10 years younger than me. So bearing in mind I was 23, they were in their really formative years. So I had huge concern for them as to how this bereavement would affect them. And actually, I think, they're grown-ups now, but I think it was okay. But I remember at the time that being my driving force with my family was just to protect the little ones, because I'm really fond of them. I helped my mum kind of bring them up. But my parents, I think, struggled with Marc's death because it was so out of their control, of course, for everybody anyway.
Yes.
And there's absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. And as I've mentioned, I'm quite a headstrong individual. So I think I was quite difficult to deal with at that time. And, I can, with the benefit of 15 years of hindsight, I can go, crikey, that must have been really hard for them. But I think we were all put through it. And the other complication around Marc's death, which is something I talk about, I'm getting used to talking more openly about Marc and his death, partly because I don't want him to be forgotten, and partly because I think a lot of why I do what I do now is because of a choice in making a difference, and it definitely links very strongly to his death. But I've sort of lost my train of thought.
You're saying something else that was really difficult, and you're getting more used to speaking about it now.
Yeah. It's definitely something I wanted to say. I've forgotten what it was.
It'll come back.
Because you asked me about,
Asked about the family.
Yeah.
Was it difficult dealing with that?
That's where I was going. got it. The thing that was difficult, especially difficult, I mean, your partner dying in a war zone is a bad enough thing. But the problem was he died over water. So he was in a helicopter crash, head-on helicopter collision, no survivors, 7 people, including him, died that day. And the difficult thing about that is that his body was missing for a long time. So, and this is part of the reason why my company were just amazing in supporting me, because not only did we have to deal with, well, he's dead, but we were still at war. And so an active war zone, casualty recovery is not necessarily the top priority, dare I say it. And I appreciate that from a military perspective. But he was missing for 10 weeks. So all the other men in the collision had been found. Some were pulled out of the water straight away. Some were down there for a couple of weeks. But with Marc's particular circumstance, I mean, I understand it a lot clearer now, having been to the inquest in the deaths and having read the investigation reports into the collision. He'd been flung a long way because he was essentially sitting on top of an almost empty fuel tank, which are quite, they're gonna blow. So he wasn't in an area where they were ever expecting him to be, and they only found him on a final sweep of the area before all the ships left that particular area. So that whole 10-week delay just compounded the grief, not only for me, but for my family and everyone as well, because, you have a memorial service. We had to have a memorial service, we felt, pretty soon after he died. And we were all coming to terms with the fact we may never have a body. And then just when you think you're coming to terms with the fact that you may never have that funeral or you may never lay that person to rest, then you go and get the news that they found him. And that again creates a really interesting dynamic, because I remember being absolutely furious with the Navy for finding him. I was like, well, what do you think you're doing? Why don't you just put him straight back? Because that's where he is now, and so they could do no right. I was cross with them for not finding him. And then when they found him, I was cross with them for finding him. And so but eventually he was repatriated to the UK and we could have our funeral and all that jazz. But I did not go to work in that time. It was a very tricky time, mentally, emotionally, dealing with all those feelings, dealing with all the unknowns, dealing with the press, because it was all in the papers and they were misquoting things, and a few times they got his rank wrong, and things that would have made him mad that I wasn't appreciative of and whatnot. So there was a constant bombardment of things to do and people to talk to and things to manage, and as well as your own physical and emotional needs, which probably weren't getting managed at all, really.
And I think that's natural because, there's so much going on. And sometimes as well, by dealing with all of those things, you're stopping yourself from feeling the actual pain. So while you're, it's almost like a protective layer in between, isn't it?
It's admin, it's stuff. Yeah, it's got to be done. Yeah,
stuff's got to be done so I can focus on this. And therefore I don't have to think about what this really means. And I would imagine, and I'm sure you'll tell me if it wasn't the case, but when they then found him, it was almost like you had to go through some of that grieving again because I'd
accepted the situation.
That's it.
And acceptance is a really interesting word, and my husband and I talk about it a lot, all the time, about acceptance of whatever situations are going on. And we've faced our fair share of trials and tribulations in our marriage, and in my husband knew Marc, he knew my partner, so that's a good thing, and that I didn't have to explain it. But it's so he knows all about my baggage, so to speak. But acceptance, I think, is so key, because all the while you're fighting against something, it creates a really interesting emotional turbulence. And I think once you can accept that something has happened or something hasn't happened, or a situation is a situation, whatever it is, I'm not just talking about death now, it's really freeing and really empowering to accept, right, okay, this is what it is, or this is my interpretation of it. And I think that's what I struggled with in the early days, was there were so many things out of my control that acceptance was really difficult to find. And I think now what I've learned with the passage of time is that you have to have the strength to accept things sometimes that are out with your control, and they're like my children, for instance. I can't control them as much as I try.
It's just not happening.
Yeah, they just have their own personalities, damn them. So it's about accepting what you have and accepting it the way that it is, and I think not trying to control it. That for me is a real key to emotional well-being, which is a big and passionate topic of mine. And I think it's no coincidence that a lot of my clients I end up working with are well-being clients or healthy food clients or whatever. They're, it helps that I was in healthcare for a long time and in pharmaceuticals for a long time, but there's a definite element of choice, and I do believe you attract certain energies, and that's all a bit spiritual, but you attract certain energies of people and clients that are attracted to your energy for a reason. And there's some wonderful synergy between my personal experiences and the sorts of work I end up doing with clients,
which is a really wonderful I'm going to say tribute, but whether it's a tribute, but it's a really wonderful way that you're able to look at it and go, actually, it has brought this about. And obviously, sorry, that's Rosie.
The dog.
You can hear in the background, the dog, not the child. Pretty sure the children are all boys. Yeah. Hopefully not named Rosie.
Yeah.
But it's about being able to bring that and use it in your everyday life. Because I know you've said that event, with losing Marc and going through that, the whole situation of 10 weeks later discovering his body and essentially having to go through it again. But that then has become fairly pivotal in taking you forward, and that you've got, I guess, that really strong desire to make sure that he's also still there as you continue forward.
Yeah, there's two things there, actually. There's a thing about his legacy and about not wanting him to be forgotten. And he does, he leaves a strong legacy with me, but I also feel very personally responsible in making sure that I talk about him. So for 15 years, I haven't really talked about him because I've been too frightened to. And also I feel like there's a perception in the world that, widows such as myself will get over it, or they'll move on, or they'll move forwards. And of course, I've married my husband 12 years ago. We have 2 wonderful, healthy children. To the outside and untrained eye, I have very much moved on, but there is no moving on. That kind of stuff stays with you. There's getting on with it, which is certainly what I've been doing. I've been getting on with my life and making sure Marc's death hasn't had a negative impact, which is the other point I wanted to make, in that, I do remember clearly after his death choosing to be accepting of the situation and choosing my attitude, because the way I saw it in the nights when I couldn't sleep and the days when I couldn't eat was that I could let this thing, like a disease, completely eat me up. And it was doing that for a long time. Or I could accept that it happened and decide to see the good in it. And at the time, there wasn't much good to be found. There was a lot of dirge and a lot of nastiness and a lot of all sorts of stuff going on. But nonetheless, I remember choosing to find positivity in a time of utter darkness. And that, I think, has been one of my redeeming features, or one of my... It's definitely a pivotal moment for me, and a character trait that I'd like to think I embody all the time, is that even in the horriblest times, there's nice things to be found. There's the simple enjoyment of life that oftentimes people forget. And, people might moan about, I've got wrinkles, or I'm getting old, or it's my 40th, or it's my 50th, or whatever. Oh no. And my attitude to that is always, and sometimes internally rather than externally, is always, aren't you lucky? Isn't it wonderful that you have the opportunity and the privilege of growing old? Because it's a privilege denied to so many. And it's, and I think as humans, we kind of forget that. We forget that about our own mortality. And that's something, my husband says this a lot, is, just keeping death close by. It's a part of life, and we have to keep it near us in order for it not to be too scary or too kind of unspoken, because people do die. all the time.
And it is strangely, this came up in another interview with somebody, I think, it's the one fact of life is you can guarantee that at some point you'll die.
That and tax. That's the two. Death and taxes. Somebody really famous said that. I don't know who it is.
Okay, let's ignore the taxes. We really don't want those.
But they're certainties, it's like there's nothing else is certain. You're not guaranteed anything in life, and I'm very aware of that, more so than most. But I do feel like part of my future is about retaining the past, and part of my future, part of my purpose. I've been doing a lot of personal work recently about purpose, because I often coach leaders and managers and organisations sometimes around their purpose. But part of my personal purpose, and I think, I've achieved a lot. I have an exceptionally happy marriage with a wonderful husband. I have 2 healthy children. They're often naughty, but they are healthy. And so I have a purpose as a wife, a purpose as a mother. I play a lot of sport. So I have purpose in going and being competitive and aiming to win in my sport. But I think you have to have multifaceted purposes. And part of my purpose, I believe, is around helping others, and specifically helping other widows, and specifically helping other widows bereaved from military people or widows from conflicts. So I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around investigating how I can help, because there's lots of charities out there that do specifically support war widows or war widows of a certain military service. And I'm really interested in doing more work with those, because I feel like it's part of my purpose. And that's a really strong driving factor for me. So I wouldn't do anything unless it was part of my purpose. And I think we're all working that out all the time, but I feel like I've stumbled across as something which, I think some people may be thinking, why is she still going on about that? It happened like 15 years ago. Shouldn't she have moved on by now? But I'm never moving on. Like, I just feel like I'm going along, I'm taking it with me, but I'm never leaving it in the past.
My impression is you're not taking it with you as a burden to carry. So and that's very different to,
yes,
I'm not moving on because I'm worn down by this thing and it's shaping everything in a very negative shape. It's more that you're going, actually, I'm taking away the good things about Marc, the things that you remember, the positives and all of those, but you're also taking on some of the things that you've learned from going through that experience, and looking at, 1, how it's changed your life, and 2, at how you can help other people. And I think that's very different to carrying it around in a negative way. So it's a positive way, because you're choosing not to forget him. You're choosing not to hide him away in a corner.
He's not
somewhere.
a secret.
No,
he's not a secret.
That's it.
And I don't want him to ever be a secret. And I don't want people to think that they can't say, "Oh, wasn't it Marc's birthday last week?" Or what are you doing on Remembrance Sunday? Or whatever. Because these things happen. These events happen. It's not going away. And they keep happening. But somehow, I think some people think, "Oh, that happened. Now she's married. Now it's kind of." It's all gone, and it's so it isn't all gone, and I have the most amazing husband, because he appreciates that it's part of me, just the same as if I had suffered a different trauma, like if I'd been in a different traumatic situation, like maybe I'd lost a limb. And this is how my husband and I talk about it a lot in our personal conversations, is we talk about Marc's death as if I did lose a limb or part of a limb, and it's never going to grow back. It's always going to be something that happened to me. I can choose my attitude about it, and I can enable it to be something that pushes me and drives me, or it can be something that weighs me down and creates bad feeling. But ultimately the expectation, there's an expectation, I think, and perhaps it's my paranoia around death, that people do think you will have moved on. But because I view it less as a death and more as a trauma, that the trauma is never going to get undone. You know what I mean?
It's always happened.
Yeah, the injury, the scar is always going to be there. And I want that scar to be positive.
Well, and if you think of it as a scar as well, the fact is that with a scar, because it's a scar, it's obviously not going away, but it does get tougher. It gets more resilient. It gets more able to cope with things. And so that's kind of where you are. It's like, I can still see it, and it's there, but I am able to do the other things. I am able to go on and enjoy my life, but I've still got that reminder of this thing that happened.
But not in a bad way.
No, exactly.
In a good way.
In a good way.
And I do hate the phrase, and people often say this when people have died, oh, that's what he would have wanted. And I can't abide that phrase, because the last thing Marc would have wanted was to die. He definitely didn't go out there thinking he was gonna. So, it's a challenging statement, I think. But if there was that's what he would have wanted, then he certainly wouldn't want his death, I don't think, to be remembered negatively. I believe if he was going to leave an impact or an imprint or a legacy, and I talk about legacy so much, not just because of Marc, but I talk about legacy all the time in terms of, you've left a legacy here today with interviewing me, and I won't forget that. The same as when I was made redundant, I didn't forget the legacy that my HR director left with me when she made redundant. I don't forget, people leave a legacy, a splash with you every time they interact with you. And
conversation with Elaine Gosden of Blue GNU Consulting. If you want to get in touch with Elaine, all of her details will be available on the show notes. And I apologize once again for the rather abrupt ending to our conversation. I will make arrangements to get Elaine back on so that you can hear more from her. Bridging Gaps, the business podcast, was produced by Debra Levitt of Bridge Road Consultants Limited, with original music provided by Pete Dineley.
You've been listening to Debra Levitt on Bridging Gaps, the business podcast.